From Kona to Yenan, The Political Memoirs of Koji Ariyoshi, edited by Alice M. Beechert and Edward D. Beechert, as read by Leopold, a biography monograph, Asian and Pacific personal papers published for the Biographical Research Center by the University of Hawaii Press, 2000. Introduction, Alice M. Beechert and Edward D. Beechert. Koji Ariyoshi was born and raised in the coffee-growing area of Kona on the Big Island of Hawaii. This background was a major force in shaping his ideas about society and the economy. His education in the Kona schools, the University of Hawaii, the University of Georgia, his work experience on the docks of Honolulu and San Francisco, and his experiences in the United States Army in Yenan, China, served to focus the sense of independence and dignity evident in his writings. A glimpse of the importance of this background in shaping Ariyoshi's sense of justice is seen in a column in the final edition of the Honolulu Record where he recalled watching the arrival of the 1924 Filipino strikers in Kona. I remember as a kid standing on the dusty roads by Marumoto's store at Captain Cook, Kona, as a couple of huge trucks packed with men, women, and children came to a stop. These were the Filipino strikers who had been evicted from their homes by the sugar plantations. We soon hired a few of the strikers on our coffee farm and they lived with us. Mother opened credit for them at the coffee company store and helped them through their initial difficult period. While a student at the University of Hawaii, Koji wrote a series of 24 articles on stevedoring on the Honolulu docks. As the Honolulu Star Bulletin said in its announcement of the series, Ariyoshi attended the university by day and continues his stevedoring at night. Ariyoshi within the past year has picked up the inside story of stevedoring and will tell it in the Star Bulletin. The series clearly indicates the pattern and tone of Ariyoshi's later writings in the Honolulu Record. Another series of Star Bulletin articles ranging over the years 1937 to 1939 graphically described the plight of the Kona coffee farmers and their crushing burden of debt, and the draconian treatment by the credit merchants. The identification of Ariyoshi with the exploited farmers of Kona was evident in his admission to the University of Georgia, where he was awarded a scholarship in journalism. There he took time to investigate the realities of working-class Georgia, the Tobacco Road, with the help of Erskine Caldwell's parents. Before 1935 and the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, Wagner Act, criminal trespass laws and criminal syndicalism laws made labor organizing a hazardous occupation. Hawaii, like most of the states, had enacted laws restricting free speech, and particularly labor organizing and union activities. The New Deal, with its promises of improvement for the common man, was viewed with some skepticism among Hawaii's workers. Charges of misuse of Works Progress Administration, WPA, workers by assigning them to plantation work confirmed the decades-long distrust of the political establishment. When Jack Hall began organizing plantation workers on Kauai in 1937, he faced a climate of fear and suspicion of haole, Caucasians. Weigh the picture, Ariyoshi said in a 1967 interview. The 1909 strike, 1920, 1924, 1937, with people starving, these were vivid memories of the total loss possible. For the majority of people there was no margin, no existence outside the plantation. All the strikes seemed to have failed, with people removed from the plantation, exiled with a loss of pride. The decision in 1938 to greatly enlarge Hawaii's military defense accelerated the changes brought about by the Depression. Thousands of new, high-paying jobs were created by the need to expand Pearl Harbor and related facilities. Plantation workers flooded into the jobs, which paid, for Hawaii, unheard-of wages. The consortium of mainland contractors was long accustomed to paying union wages on such projects. Both the high wages and an influx of unionized construction workers from the mainland helped to create a new mood in Hawaii's working-class population. One of Koji's Kona High School classmates, working as a carpenter at Pearl Harbor, first learned of the existence of Hawaii's Carpenters Union from a mainland worker anxious to deposit his union card at the local office to maintain his retirement and disability benefits. The union, chartered in 1901, was largely unknown to the cottage builders and the many carpenters working on the plantations. Before World War II, Hawaii was largely a two-class society, a small, self-perpetuating ruling elite closely allied with the large military presence in Hawaii, and a large, low-income, plantation laboring class. As a consequence of World War II, Hawaii underwent a veritable revolution in both its economy and its political structure. Since the end of the war, industry-wide strikes in the basic industries of sugar, pineapple, and longshore trade had upset the traditional, oligarchical structure that had dominated Hawaii since the formation of a Western-style government in 1850. The International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, footnote. The name was changed in 1995 to the International Longshore and Warehouse Union to eliminate the gender implication. Footnote end. ILWU was a primary instrument in changing the thinking of Hawaii's workers. The democratic structure of the union gave workers the opportunity for leadership in their plantation communities. The capacity of the plantation workers for effective leadership was the key to success in the 1946 sugar strike. In effect, this created a new, larger community for the workers, replacing the oligarchic organization which had dominated the plantations. There were many possibilities of recognition. A Hohana, Weeding, man could be a unit leader. The abolition of made people more independent. The union provided a sense of community, particularly for the Filipinos. By 1948, Ariyoshi judged the time was ripe for a labor-oriented newspaper which would expose the oligarchical nature of the Hawaiian political economy, and serve to bolster the growing labor movement. $5 shares were sold to the growing labor community and urban liberals. John Rienecke and Dwight James Freeman were especially active in increasing the circulation of the paper among plantation workers in the neighbor islands of Kauai, Maui, and Hawaii. The volume of neighbor island business advertising in the new paper suggests a reasonable amount of support among the 33,000 sugar and pineapple workers. Increasingly unified by the success of ILWU organizing efforts and the success of the 1946 industry-wide sugar strike, the workers were ready, both Ariyoshi and the ILWU believed, for a sophisticated analysis of Hawaii's political economy. With a clear labor and radical perspective, Ariyoshi focused the newspaper on the rapidly evolving labor organizations and the oligarchical society that made Hawaii so distinctive. Many articles featured the low standard of living of many of Hawaii's people. The Hawaii Sugar Planters Association's vaunted social welfare programs of the 1920s had collapsed with the Depression, and the majority of the plantation communities showed the signs of neglect. Plantation villages were often little more than shanty towns. The steady displacement of plantation workers, which began in the mid-1950s with the mechanization of planting and harvesting processes, produced a flood of people into the urban center of Honolulu. The first 3 years of the newspaper were marked by a constant struggle to expand the readership and to deal with the chronic lack of operating capital. The paper began by using a hand-fed press. Each sheet was then hand-folded. The small staff wrote stories under made-up bylines, as well as their own. They depended heavily on their supporters in the labor movement for leads and information. The first anniversary edition of the paper was typical of the style. A banner headline proclaimed U.S. sewage is social crime, and was accompanied by a photograph of an open sewer ditch. Inside, a comprehensive chart of the so-called Big Five companies was spread over 2 pages. Not the Big Five, the Big One, headed the diagram showing the close connections between the firms and their overlapping boards of directors. Hilo's Bloody Monday was recalled by Harry Kamoku, organizer of the 1938 march on Hilo Harbor by 500 Unionists, and their supporters. Police used tear gas, riot guns, and bayonets against the demonstrators. Kamoku had organized the Hilo Longshoremen, and had applied for a charter from the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA. By 1949 he was president of the Hawaii Longshore Division of Local 136 of the ILWU. The resolution adopted by the 18,000 sugar workers of Local 142, representing all the main sugar producers, summed up the position of Ariyoshi's fledgling newspaper in a full-page advertisement. Resolution. Whereas, the Big Five, through its economic domination of a large majority of Hawaii's commercial newspapers, are able to hide their union-breaking program from the people. Whereas, the Honolulu Record is the only newspaper in the territory that presents true, factual, and complete reports on all controversial issues and events. Now therefore be it resolved that the General Executive Board of the United Sugar Workers, ILWU Local 142, endorse the Honolulu Record and urge our members to subscribe to the paper. By the time of the 3rd anniversary edition, the paper had refined and sharpened its style. The feature story was about money smuggling by Philippine government travelers, using Hawaii travel agents and airline employees to launder the money. The tactic was to bring in large sums of Philippine pesos and smuggle U.S. dollars back into the Philippines to take advantage of the extreme black market rates there. A centerpiece feature was how Kauai is owned, showing Kauai's land distribution. The campaign of 1950 against substandard housing was declared responsible for improvements to Kahuku Plantation Village, with the removal of outdoor toilets and open sewers. A story on the Korean War's impact on the Hawaii economy by the Bank of Hawaii chief economist indicated that Hawaii could expect little benefit. That edition also marked the beginning of a serious assault on the newspaper and the ILWU. Ariyoshi's front-page editorial dealt with the testimony of Jack Kawano, former president of ILWU Honolulu Longshore Activities Committee in Washington, D.C. In this period of built-up hysteria, when fear stalks the land, when civil liberties are trampled upon by those who gloat over the Taft-Hartley and the Smith Acts, Jack Kawano went to Washington to serve the notorious Un-American Committee. In 25,000 apparently well-rehearsed words, he stoops to the role of a fingerman, smearing, fabricating, and becoming a tool of the worst anti-labor, racist agencies we have in government. Kawano's testimony was to the effect that he had turned to the Communist Party in 1935 to 1936 in his efforts to organize longshoremen on the Honolulu waterfront. He gave detailed accounts in the manner of other Smith Act informants in that period. Like most of the informers, his memory of events was more vivid than the reality. He placed Ariyoshi at Communist Party meetings in Honolulu in 1946 when Ariyoshi was serving in the U.S. Army in China. Kawano also described a meeting Ariyoshi held with Tokuda, a Japanese Communist Party leader, who was at that time serving an 18-year prison sentence in Japan. The week following Kawano's testimony, the record carried the response of the ILWU Executive Board of Local 136. They described Kawano's career and his change over the years from a militant longshoreman, 1OF the group of original organizers in 1935 to 1936, to president of the local at the time of the 1949 longshore strike. Refusing to carry out his leadership duties, Kawano broke away from the union and was subsequently dropped from the union for non-payment of dues and failure to work. The Cold War hysteria which marked the post-war period was reflected in Hawaii. There had long existed an attitude of the upper class and government hierarchy which regarded the large, non-Caucasian population with great suspicion. The intelligence branches of the Army and the Navy devoted their attention primarily to the large Asian population. Intelligence files carried weekly reports on activities of Hawaii's civilian population. What distinction was made between aliens and citizens if they were of Asian ancestry? Footnote: see DAWS 368-69, FUTCH 310-311. Many of the military intelligence reports are to be found in the National Archives. For Navy intelligence, see Record Group 38, Office of Naval Intelligence. For U.S. Army files on Hawaii, CRG 165, Military Intelligence Division. The files of the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI, are in National Archives. Investigative files of the Bureau of Investigation, File BS 202,600-5, Reel 47, 1918 to 1921. These files deal almost exclusively with people of Japanese ancestry. Footnote end. The first major red-baiting campaign culminated in 1947 with the firing of school teachers John and Eiko Rieneki. The commanding general and his chief of intelligence presented Governor Ingram Steinbach, newly reappointed the previous year, with a list of alleged communists in Hawaii. Their material featured the ILWU and its supporters as merely part of a Communist Party organization. Local politics were swept into the whirlwind of communist hysteria. When Truman reappointed Steinbach, a Democrat, as governor of the territory, local Democratic leaders complained that Steinbach ignored the Democratic Territorial Central Committee. Steinbach accused the Democratic leader, Mayor John Wilson, and his chief assistant, of being under communist influence. As a sign of the changing political fortunes, the governor complained to Washington that practically no white men were elected to any position in the local party and that Haole Democrats of Hawaii seemed to have no chance to win in inter-party struggles. Footnote: FUTCH 312 and 13. The changes in the Hawaiian political economy would culminate in the election in 1954 of a Democratic majority in the territorial legislature, a majority comprised largely of non-Caucasians. Footnote end. Confronted with the prospect of local people coalescing into an effective political organization, the Big Five Republican coalition seized the opportunity to paint their opposition and the labor movement with the communist smear. Looking back, one writer concluded, the communist issue was, in a sense, the last gasp of the Big Five in its long domination of the labor force in the islands. The congressional committees were busy linking the issue of communist influence with the labor movement and with the rapidly rising sentiment for statehood for Hawaii. The House Un-American Activities Committee held a hearing in Honolulu on April 10, 1950, using the testimony of Akiro Izuka to label the 1949 longshore strike a communist plot. Of the 70 witnesses summoned, 39 refused to testify, becoming known as the Reluctant 39. The committee had little more than the usual guilt by association evidence other than the testimony of Izuka. A byproduct of the hearings was a separate report on the Honolulu Record. The slim report did disclose the fact that the paper had a total of 60 stockholders, which represented a beginning capital of $6,800, and sustained a net loss of $2,351.91 in its first year of operation. The Smith Act trials. Koji Ariyoshi had been editor of the Honolulu Record for 3 years when Federal Bureau of Investigation agents arrested 7 people on August 28, 1951, on charges of being members of the Communist Party, and hence part of a conspiracy to teach and advocate the necessity of overthrowing the government of the United States by force and violence. The 7 were Koji Ariyoshi, Jack Hall, John E. Rieneki, Charles and Eileen Fujimoto, Danishi Jack Komodo, and Dwight James Freeman. Hall, well known as the regional director of the ILWU in Hawaii since 1944, appeared to be the principal target. Ariyoshi, as editor of a radical, labor-oriented newspaper, was also in the public eye. Charles Fujimoto, a University of Hawaii soil chemist, had publicly announced himself as Hawaii chairman of the Communist Party in 1948. Eileen Fujimoto was a secretary for the Longshoremen's Division of ILWU Local 142. Rieneki, Komodo, and Freeman held various positions on the Honolulu Record. The newspaper came out on August 30, 1951, with an editorial by Ariyoshi in which he expressed his confidence that the workers of Hawaii would realize from their own experiences that the allegation of teaching the overthrow of the government by force and violence is fantastic. Subscribers to the Record have read the views of the editor week after week for more than 3 years. The case of the Hawaii 7 was the latest in a series of trials which began with the indictment of the leadership of the Communist Party of the United States in July 1948. That indictment, like the Hawaii indictment, charged that the defendants willfully and knowingly conspired to 1. Organize as the Communist Party of the United States of America, a society, group and assembly of persons who teach and advocate the overthrow and destruction of the government of the United States by force and violence, and 2. Knowingly and willfully to advocate and teach the duty and necessity of overthrowing and destroying the government of the United States by force and violence. The verdict in the 1948 trial of the national leadership was tested only as to the constitutionality of the Smith Act of 1940. It is often overlooked that the validity of the evidence against the defendants was not examined. The Supreme Court said it would evaluate the evidence and the conduct of the trial at a later time. The Chief Justice wrote, whether on this record, 9 months of trial, 18,000 pages of record, petitioners did in fact advocate the overthrow of the government by force and violence is not before us, and we must base any discussion of this point upon the conclusion stated in the opinion of the Court of Appeals, which treated the issue in great detail. The second series of trials of the Communist Party, the Pittsburgh trials, dealt with the credibility of informers. In this case, the court ordered a new trial. The third set of trials, those of the California Communist Party, finally reached the question of the validity of evidence and the conduct of the trial. In the 1957 Yates decision, the court imposed new standards of evidence, which were to render the conviction of the Communist Party officials and members under the law vastly more difficult. The court established a careful distinction between mere advocacy of doctrine and advocacy of action. Only the latter could be prosecuted under the Smith Act. Advocacy of an abstract doctrine was quite different from advocacy of action. Justice Harlan wrote that advocacy of doctrine is too remote from concrete action to be regarded as the kind of indoctrination preparatory to action. The essential distinction is that those to whom the advocacy is addressed must be urged to do something, now or in the future, rather than to merely believe in something. Mere advocacy of revolution or change in government was protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. Under this new ruling, over 30 indictments and convictions were dismissed, including those of the Hawaii 7. The 1957 Yates decision overturning the conviction of the California Communist Party leaders left open the door to proceeding against those advocating action to overthrow the government. Justice Hugo Black pointed to the anomaly he saw in the majority opinion. The court says that persons can be punished for advocating action to overthrow the government by force and violence, where those to whom the advocacy is addressed are urged to do something, now or in the future, rather than merely to believe in something. Under the court's approach, defendants could still be convicted simply for agreeing to talk as distinguished from agreeing to act. 2 weeks before the Yates decision, the Supreme Court handed down a ruling devastating to this type of political prosecution. Clinton Jenks, a union organizer, had been convicted for allegedly filing a false non-communist oath as required by the Taft-Hartley revision of the National Labor Relations Act. Footnote: the evidence of Jenks' alleged perjury came from 2 paid FBI informers. Footnote end. The Attorney General had customarily used FBI-paid informers to testify against Smith Act defendants. Their reports to the FBI were ruled to be confidential and not available to the accused. Similar witnesses were used in the Hawaii trial. The court held that the accused must have the opportunity of impeaching witnesses against them. In a 7-1 ruling, the court held that the government was required to produce for inspection all reports of Madiso and Ford, FBI informers, in its possession, written and, when orally made, as recorded by the FBI, touching the events and activities as to which they testified at the trial. With a few exceptions, the Jenks and Yates decisions put an effective end to the prosecution of people for membership in the Communist Party. In 1961, the court did distinguish between passive and active membership, upholding a conviction on the latter charge. Footnote: Scales v. United States 367 U.S. 203. The majority opinion held that active membership in an organization which advocates the overthrow of the government of the United States by force and violence constituted a felony under the Smith Act. Footnote end. Over 100 indictments were dropped in the face of these adverse decisions. Trial of the Hawaii Seven. On June 19, 1953, after 7.5 months of listening to the government's paid witnesses and the handful of local opportunists striving for their few minutes in the spotlight, the jury returned its verdict of guilty. Ariyoshi's response was printed in the next issue of the Record, Who Are the Guilty? He made clear that the verdict was aimed at the labor community. The immediate response of almost 50,000 ILWU members was to hold stop-work meetings on their respective work sites to denounce the verdict and pledge support for an appeal. Not surprisingly, these stop-work meetings were termed political strikes by employers and denounced as violations of the contracts. Ariyoshi began his editorial with this statement: "The historical Smith Act frame-up in this territory has been answered by the unprecedented mass protest in the basic sugar, pineapple, longshore, and miscellaneous industries. There is a mass protest on the one hand and a mixed feeling of jubilation and anxiety among big employers on the other." Immediately following the verdict, the defense filed a motion for a new trial, charging among other items that the jury had been harassed and intimidated. One juror filed an affidavit with the court stating that he had voted for a guilty verdict out of fear for his family. All told, some 33 points were raised by the defense. The motion was denied and 6 of the defendants were sentenced to 5-year prison terms, with a 3-year term for Eileen Fujimoto. Though bail was raised to $15,000 for each person, the money was raised and an appeal filed. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the convictions of the Hawaii Seven in January 1958 based on the June 1957 Yates U.S. Supreme Court decision. Footnote: Yates v. United States distinguished between advocacy of doctrine and advocacy of action. The first is protected by the First Amendment. In addition, the indictments of the Communist Party leaders were invalid because of the 3-year statute of limitations. The Communist Party had been dissolved in 1942 and reconstituted in 1945. Footnote end. For some of the Hawaii Seven, the immediate prospects were not good. Employment was difficult, given the level of Cold War hysteria. The Korean War was a new experience for a society conditioned to assume, automatically, that the United States was invincible. Ariyoshi's views on the war were centered more on the plight of the Korean people, both North and South, than on the Cold War themes emphasized by the United States. Footnote: Ariyoshi's editorials emphasized the similarities between Japan's characterization of its assault on Asia as a move to free Asians, and America's description of the war as one for democracy. I see much the same pattern today in Korea, where the Korean people are called gooks, as in Japan where MacArthur or Ridgway and his staff are first-class citizens and the Japanese are segregated in their own country. See also the 18th of November 1951, for a similar commentary. Hugh Dean's recently published book, The Korean War, 1945 to 1953, confirms many of Ariyoshi's views. Footnote end. The prolonged stalemate in Korea belied the grandiose statements of the military and political leaders. For those opposed to the U.S. conduct of the war, the end result was to further isolate those charged with being radicals. Ariyoshi, Rioneki, and Freeman continued putting out the Honolulu Record, trying to build subscriptions and advertising revenue. The newspaper continued its crusade to improve the social and economic fortunes of the working class, and participated in the growing political strength of that class. The Democratic Party under the leadership of John Burns had gradually expanded the participation and election of local people, until, in 1954, the Democratic Party achieved a majority in the legislature for the first time since Hawaii became a territory of the United States. This was a process which had begun in 1937, when Jack Hall organized the Kauai Progressive League among plantation workers, who then ousted Kauai's 2 patrician planters from the territorial senate. Many of the conditions and practices on which the record reported were now part of the mainstream political agenda, as the new political majority more closely resembled the working people of Hawaii. As the political climate changed, the old alarms about radicalism and conspiracies diminished. Although some of the old establishment continued to preach the dangers of communism and the threat of the Asian population, they had clearly lost the political clout they once had. A new issue now was the center of attention: statehood. The Honolulu record was a casualty of these changing circumstances. Rising costs and an inability to expand the readerships of Ariyoshi, although saddened by the closure of his newspaper, looked forward to the opening of a new union-sponsored newspaper. The ILWU decided to launch a new, community-oriented, liberal newspaper. A mainland editor was brought in and the Hawaiian Reporter was launched on June 18, 1959. Ariyoshi worked on this newspaper during its brief 5-month life. The newspaper failed to reach a circulation level that would enable it to break even, and the union closed the newspaper. Ariyoshi, faced with the need to earn a living for his family, turned to small business, opening a liquor store and flower shop in Waikiki. From 1960 until his return to public life in 1970, this was his primary activity. In 1969, he was appointed by Governor Burns, a longtime friend, to the board of directors of the newly created Hawaii Foundation for History and the Humanities. In 1972, he was elected president of the foundation. While continuing his business, the focus of his attention shifted to developing the foundation. The concerns displayed over the nearly 10 years as editor and publisher of the Honolulu Record were clearly reflected in the inaugural address of the new foundation president. This foundation is not only a new organization, but an agency whose responsibilities embody a concern that has surfaced only recently, often with fury and militancy, and has made our country restless. This concern is the yearning and demand of our ethnic minorities for full recognition and identity, and with a desire to have their history told without evasion or equivocation or distortion. They want a people's history, not the exposition of sovereignty and power. Ariyoshi was anxious to focus the foundation on something more than historic site preservation. He noted that the new appreciation of history, archaeology, and historic site preservation were important, but only as a basis for giving people the knowledge of past societies to make a better people and a better world. Important in this respect was the task of collecting oral histories, to give a dignified place in history to those who toiled with their hands to nurture a new generation, always struggling to create opportunities for their future generations. A step in this direction was the making of a film on the closing of Kilauea Plantation on Kauai in December 1971. Ariyoshi and newsman Bob Barker did the interviewing of Kilauea residents. A 45-minute film was produced by Hawaii Educational Television, KHET, and shown both on the air and in schools throughout the state. A second important project was the establishment of the Ethnic Research and Resource Center in 1972 to collect the fragments of history. The materials for people's history are scattered everywhere. They must be searched for, they must be gathered. Return to China. The years 1971 and 1972 would return Koji Ariyoshi to the world of journalism and foreign affairs. While serving in the U.S. Army, he spent a year and a half, October 1944 to March 1946, in China in the Yenan caves. Koji was well known to the leadership of the People's Republic of China, particularly to Zhou Enlai. Always interested in China, Ariyoshi formed a new business, China Products, Inc., an import-export business that was later expanded to include tours to China. In 1970, he organized the U.S. China People's Friendship Association in Hawaii and served as president. By June 1971, China was receiving American visitors, and Koji was among those invited. The Honolulu Star Bulletin engaged him to go to China as its special correspondent and to interview Zhou Enlai. His January 1972 reports from China preceded President Nixon's visit of February 21st. The high point of the series was a 4-hour interview with Zhou Enlai. His remaining years were busy with the flower shop, Polynesian exotics, and his new China-related business, as well as the Foundation for History and the Humanities. An important activity was lecturing to university classes and advising the newly formed Ethnic Studies program at the University of Hawaii. Koji Ariyoshi died of cancer on October 23, 1976, at the age of 62.